What's up, gamer girls? Welcome back. One of the central promises of the resurgent progressive left that we've largely seen since Bernie's rise to prominence was that it was them and their message alone that could deliver unto the Democratic Party a sizable base of working class support, particularly bringing in non-voters. Despite all the big promises, both times Bernie ran, he failed to win, which isn't entirely his fault. That's its own, conspiracy little moment. But for the sake of our discussion today, one of the failures of his campaigns was to deliver on that promise to turn out new voters. So a question for those of us who still at least have a glimmer of hope that electoralism can lead to anything, which as the days pass I become less hopeful for. An important question to building the types of coalitions we would like to see is, how do we win over the working class, particularly the disaffected working class? Luckily for us, Jacobin teamed up with YouGov here. They ask a variety of complicated questions to a variety of types of working class people all over the country. And through the responses they receive, they attempt to gain an understanding as to how one would build a winning coalition or, solidify a labor movement. Let's get into it. Also, as they put here, and I'm going to zoom in because it's very, very tiny. For the purposes of this study, we generally measure the working class as individuals without a 4-year college degree. So while they acknowledge in the following sentence this does create its own form of limitations, for example, I would argue working in theater, most of the technicians, I should say, that work even full-time in the industry would probably fall into income brackets of what we might understand as working class, but a lot of us, had to go get a 4-year degree, or at least were convinced we needed one before we started working. So while there are limitations to this definition, I also think it's a strength, because one counterpoint that a lot of people might have, and this is a straw man, of course, but some conservative might say like, oh, well, you're polling too many jobless socialists who got like lesbian basket weaving degrees but only make, $20K a year, so really the data's skewed. So in that sense, I think it's a strength to the results of this study that it focuses very specifically on those who haven't gone to college, as I feel like that's maybe a better representation of the kind of populations we're looking to win over. Because if you just polled college-educated kids, they might emphasize saying Latin X in every speech, whereas we know from the data that that's not exactly how Hispanic people even want to use that word. Now, let's start to get into how the survey itself is structured. Our hypothetical candidate profiles included a variety of demographic characteristics, like race, gender, and class, and several attributes that allow us to measure the saliency of policy issues and rhetoric in different ways. Bundles of key policy issues, ranging from progressive to conservative economic, health, and civil rights positions, day one priorities, and messaging styles. Each communication style is delivered in the form of a hypothetical soundbite. These include the progressive populist, somebody like Bernie Sanders, the woke progressive, more so your squad member. And the key difference here is it's not about a difference in what they actually believe, but it is crucially about how it's delivered. Like, yes, AOC gets way too wrapped up in some activist academia language sometimes, whereas Bernie is a lot more like, people are tired of working for $11 an hour. It's probably a mid-tier Bernie impression, but we're moving on. One of the other styles is woke moderate, people like Kamala Harris and Kristen Gillibrand. And then there's the mainstream moderate, somebody like Ol' Uncle Joe. And then finally, the Republican, a message drawn from generic Republican Party rhetoric in the Trump era. They offered more than 24,000 distinct candidate profiles to potential voters to assess which Democratic candidates perform best among working class voters in swing states. But anyways, as an example, here's what those candidate profiles would look like. You have their day one priorities, their affiliation, their soundbite, what their race or ethnicity is, what their prior occupation was, their gender, and their key issues. And they use all these data points to try to figure out which aspects of a candidate are most appealing to people. For example, both of these candidates in this example are women who used to be CEOs of a Fortune 500 company, and they both have 2 of the top 3 same key issues, but their differences include what they list as their day one priorities, their race, and how they pitch themselves. So given which aspects are controlled for and which aspects are different, we could see how working class voters respond to these different parts of a candidate when in contrast. And here we go, I finally found how many people they polled. 400 individuals, which is pretty low, but it is from 5 specific swing states, so that's really interesting to look at. Hold on a second there, past Piley. It's future Piley here. I have some news. They surveyed 2,000 people like I originally thought. The 400 number is 400 people from each state. So it's not 400 people across 5 states, it's 2,000 people across 5 states. Let's go through and read what the sound bites sound like. That's almost a bar. This country belongs to all of us, not just the super rich, but for years, politicians in Washington have turned their backs on people who work for a living. We need tough leaders who won't give in to the millionaires and the lobbyists, but will fight for good jobs, good wages, and guaranteed health care for every single American. That's the progressive populist. The woke progressive, the people closest to pain should be the people closest to power. In Washington, the wealthy and the privileged make the rules. But if you're poor or an immigrant or a person of color, then you know how hard it is just to survive in this country. We need courageous leaders who will protect the most vulnerable, fight for justice, and make transformative change. And I hope the difference there is clear. Like in this one, the sort of universalist good jobs, good wages policies that the progressive is talking about would benefit the same communities the woke progressive makes sure to note. They just make their language universalist rather than more specific. Then we have the woke moderate. Our unity is our strength and our diversity is our power. But for too long, special interests have blocked critical progress in addressing systemic racism, climate change, and access to affordable healthcare. We need creative leaders who will fight for our values, listen to the experts, and make real change happen. This candidate isn't even a real person, and I can already just feel a seething anger for how much, like, CNN would gush over this soundbite were it real. Then there's the mainstream moderate. We have to stop demonizing each other based on which party we support, how much money we make, or the color of our skin. It's time to heal. We need common sense leaders who will stick up for working people, listen to the experts, reach across the aisle, and get things done. And then we have the Republican. What makes America great is the freedom of the American people, but today, our freedom is under threat from radical socialists, arrogant liberals, and dangerous foreign influences. We need strong leaders in Washington to protect conservative values and defend the Constitution against those who want to destroy the greatest country in the world. Yeah, like Michael Flynn, who wants this to be a one-religion country. And then we have a set few prior occupations: teacher, the construction worker, the small business owner, the CEO, the lawyer, and the veteran. Now, folks, is the moment I know you've all been waiting for. We finally arrived at the detailed results. The top line result is actually one of the more interesting. It is literally irrelevant whether a candidate is a male or a female. To explain how to interpret this data, because I realized I skipped over the section where they explained that, this line in the middle represents 0.5, and the way they score these results is they give a yes a score of 1 and a no a score of 0, which means that on average, across all the different demographics, it is a dead tie between whether the candidate is a woman or a guy, which is oddly baffling. I guess I would have expected the data to skew one way or the other, but oh well, I get we've reached true gender equality, folks. As far as day one priorities are concerned, racial justice is below the mean, but less popular than that is making immigration your day one priority. Which is funny, but I do wonder how that data might be skewed for border states, for example. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if immigration scored a little better for working class voters in, like, Texas or Arizona. The 3 day one priorities that had a positive score were jobs, healthcare, and the economy. Next, we have each candidate's top 3 issues. The data for issue 1 is pretty minimal, like jobs guarantee is slightly better than the mean, empowering small businesses is slightly below, and cut government spending is slightly below that. But when you get into issue 2 and issue 3, you have these massive gaps. For example, issue 2, we find a contradiction to the day one priority results. and systemic racism was a pretty popular policy, which suggests that it's not so much that working class voters are this inherently conservative bloc, just more so that it's about where you focus your attention. Like if you heard somebody, focus on jobs and the economy and also was in favor of civil rights, that appears to do well, whereas listing racial justice as your number one priority doesn't seem to do as well. Also, I find it funny that issue 3, repeal and replace Obamacare, is one of the lowest responses overall, whereas Medicare for All does better than just increasing ACA subsidies, which suggests that, universal policies really do win people over, as opposed to ACA, where, people can come in and make arguments about like, well, why am I paying for someone else's bad choices, as opposed to a universal system like Medicare for All. When it comes to prior occupation, that which did the absolute worst is a former CEO. That which did the best were teachers. Veterans, small business owners, and construction workers also scored above the mean, whereas lawyers scored just below the mean. And finally, one of the most important takeaways from this study, the soundbite that won the most people over, was Populist Progressive, while the candidate that did the worst was Republican. But interestingly enough, the progression from most popular to least popular goes Populist Progressive, then mainstream moderate, so Bernie is slightly more successful than a Joe Biden, is marginally more successful than a Hillary Clinton, and then even less successful, funny enough, is somebody like an AOC, which really does give credence to the idea that it's not the progressive policies that are turning off people. It is rather how you package all of those into a platform and just overall how you sell yourself. Now here's where we start to break the data down by independent variables. For example, here we're measuring age. We see that really any Democratic candidate does pretty well with people under 44, but that woke progressives really lose the above 45 demographics. We also see that the most popular candidate with those above 65 is the mainstream moderate, whereas the populist progressive is the most popular with the 45 to 64. And if my eyes aren't fooling me here, because there's no number, I just kind of have to hold my hand up and see which one is further to the right. It looks like with the younger people, the populist progressive is the most popular as well. Here we see how the sound bites win over people of different ethnicities, and while it follows the usual trends we've been noting so far, what I find really interesting from these results is that Republicans do best with white people, but also the fact that each of the Hispanic results have such a wide range, and that range basically means margin of error based on their results, which you could say is the result of not having that many respondents maybe that were Hispanic, but that also strikes me as that it reflects just how diverse Hispanic people are. I also find it interesting here, while they generally favor Democratic candidates, mainstream moderates fared better with Hispanics than populist progressives. Whereas when it came to white and black people, the progressive populist was the most popular. Which just suggests that, more work needs to be done to bring those people into our coalitions. Now we get to probably one of the more important results of the study. How do people in small towns differ from those in the cities? I feel like most people could predict how 4 out of these 5 results would work, that the small town rural people would be slightly more in favor of Republicans. But the most interesting result of all of this comes with the populist progressive, because small town and rural people responded marginally better to populist progressives than suburban or city folk, which is a pretty big indictment of sort of, mainstream narratives about to win over small town people, you have to be as conservative adjacent as possible. Whereas, according to the study, apparently if you want to win over small town or rural working class independents, you take Bernie's approach, not the approach of AOC or even a Clinton type. For these next few graphs, we get into some other elements of class, like income, for example. First thing that jumps off the page to me, those who make above 100K favor the woke moderate, the mainstream moderate, and the populist progressive pretty equally, whereas anyone making under 100K prefer the populist progressive over literally any other candidate. which just points to how fickle upper middle class voters are. Maybe you shouldn't organize your party around appealing to this very specific class of people. So what's becoming really clear the more I dig into these is that Republicans are more popular with groups that are slightly of means, whereas the populist progressive either does better than or essentially ties with the mainstream moderate when it comes to those who are less of means. Here we have how the respondents self-identify their class, and we find that, funny enough, for upper middle class folks, they have the least favorable opinions of Republicans, and are pretty solidly split in between the four different types of Democrats. Whereas those that self-identify as middle class, their number one choice is a mainstream moderate, on top of the fact that they do best with Republicans. Which in a vacuum, some conservative type might look at to say like, see, it's those upper middle class spoiled brats that are voting for all the dumb people. But what I find funny is that those who self-identify as working class score the highest for the populist progressive, and those who identify as working class and low income have the least favorable view of Republicans outside of the upper middle class. Which makes sense, the Republican Party and, neoliberal economics in general tries to sell itself to these middle-class folks. Here we see how the respondents' self-identified party influences their thoughts. We have the obvious examples that those who lean Republican are the most in favor of Republican candidates, and those who lean Democrats are the least in favor of Republican candidates. But the more important takeaways from this section is the fact that independents do best with populist progressives, and that people who lean Republican are only slightly less favorable to populist progressives than they are mainstream moderates. It is in fact the woke moderate, your Clinton type, that does the worst with both independents and lean Republicans. So once again, we see that having a bold, universal economic message isn't exactly the cancer that Democratic Party elites would have you believe it is. Next, we have some data sets in tandem. It fits some trends we might expect at this point, that the populist progressive who focuses on, jobs and economy stuff fares the best, whereas Republicans focusing on racial justice fare the worst. But what I find really interesting is the fact that woke progressives do okay when they're talking about jobs and the economy, but a woke progressive who cites racial justice as their day one policy does some of the worst among the Democratic options. Which suggests that it's not even just about how you overall sell yourself, but that highlighting specific issues can do you wonders or really kill your campaign. Next, we have your messaging style paired with your prior occupation. And we see that the generally favorable fields like teacher and veteran and small business owner, populist progressives do far and away the best. And as we've started to notice as a trend, Republicans, by the by, do the worst. But I find it interesting that being a former CEO ranks as 3 of the 4 worst possible profiles for a Democratic-leaning candidate, but is one of the more favorable outcomes for a Republican candidate. I'm sure a movement committed to idolizing and glorifying the rich as these glorious job creators has a little something to do with that. Next, we look at the differences between how rural and city folks respond to a variety of factors. For example, while rural or small-town voters have a slight better favor toward white candidates, they also have a slight better favor toward Latino candidates and have a slight unfavorability toward Asian candidates, which is just interesting. I don't know what to say about that. It just is interesting to me. Then you have the day one priority split. City folks respond better to racial justice. Small-town rural folks don't. Small-town rural folks respond better to jobs, whereas city folks don't. Neither group are terribly fond of immigration, but it's funny that rural folks are slightly less. Both folks are equally split on their thoughts on healthcare, and rural folks are more likely to vote for a candidate that prioritizes the economy. When we dig into the weeds a little bit, we start to see some trends that one could have maybe expected. For example, cut government spending does slightly better with rural folks than it does with city dwellers, as does empowering small businesses. And while end systemic racism isn't unfavorable to rural or small town folks, it isn't as favorable as it is for city folks. Similar can be said of repeal and replace Obamacare, which isn't favored at all, but it does markedly better with rural Americans than city slickers. Also, I find it kind of interesting that when it comes to the prior occupation of the candidates, they agree in unfavorability towards Fortune 500 companies, they agree favorably towards construction workers and teachers, but rural small town folks have much more favorability toward veterans and small business owners and less favorability towards lawyers, whereas city dwelling folks have slight unfavorabilities for small business owners and veterans and a net positive favorability toward lawyers. Next, we control the results based on whether you self-identify as a voter or not. Some interesting findings here. Non-voters have a net unfavorability toward Democrats, and they're the first major group we've seen have a net favorability toward Republicans. However, they also don't mind independents running as Democrats. They do generally more so favor economic issues and have less favorability towards racial justice or immigration. Some funny little quirks in the data here. While non-voters are more favorable towards cutting government spending, which kind of fits into this bill of like non-voters at times being more conservative, they're less favorable to protect our law enforcement, which is just kind of funny. Also, while non-voters more highly favor increasing ACA subsidies, they have a net unfavorability for both repeal and replace Obamacare, as well as Medicare for All. Which obviously isn't to say we need to abandon Medicare for All in favor of fucking more ACA subsidies. What it means is just when it comes to non-voters specifically, it's not as popular. And funny enough, to further back up my smart, very correct take, we see that when it comes to non-voters, while they are the only major group we've seen so far to favor the Republican soundbite, populist progressives do even better than Republicans with non-voters, which creates a bit of a weird conundrum. You have some key policy proposals of populist progressives that don't do quite as well, like Medicare for All, but the way they talk wins these people over more. It's interesting. It baffles me, but in a fun way that tickles my brain. Similar conclusions can be drawn about independents versus partisans or those who lean either direction. While some Republican policies like repeal and replace Obamacare do better than some progressive policies, populist progressives do about as well as Republicans with these groups. Skipping down a little bit, because I'm starting to lose my voice, and this is a really long study, we have this really interesting look at how one's messaging is combined with the party they identify as. And the most interesting combination here, which is something I didn't think we would see, but when populist progressives were running as Republicans, they do just as well as mainstream moderates running as independents or populist progressives running as independents. I bring this up just because I feel like in a small anecdotal sense, this kind of explains the appeal of Donald Trump. Like the fact that some of his 2016 campaign messaging could be pulled out of context and attributed to Bernie, and it might make sense if maybe you removed some of the more racialized language, speaks to the fact that the messaging is popular even when it's not coming from a party we might expect it to. Okay, whew, I had to skip over quite a few data points because, as I said, this is a very long, well thought out study. By the way, as I'm wrapping up here, I absolutely recommend you all go check this out. The details are all really interesting, the methodology is really strong, and in general, I hope they get a chance to do this study again, just with a bigger sample size. I would be curious to see how the results differ if you polled 10,000 people, across a couple different states. I would also love to see how the data differs when controlled for each state that they come from. Even scrolling through the whole thing, I didn't see a different section for like how North Carolina voters respond rather than Pennsylvania or Nevada voters, for example. But in general, I think there's a lot of really interesting nuance to be learned from all this. And if I had to pick one takeaway to really emphasize here, it would be that universal economic programs are pretty popular with the working class. While not every sub-demographic of working class people quite so neatly fits into those boxes, we still see, even with the groups more so favorable to Republicans, that populist progressives still do pretty well. Rather than being convinced that the solution is to run away scared from, progressive populism, instead we should embrace, universal economic programs. And maybe just try to stay away from some of the overly academic, activist language that we see people like in the squad being quite fond of. Anyways, that's about all I have the time or energy to say. I'm literally seconds away from having spent 2 hours talking about and looking at all this shit. Thanks for watching, everyone. Now I'm gonna turn it on over to my pre-recorded outro. Be sure to toss me a like and subscribe down below. But if you really want to help me out, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, like early versions of every video, and exclusive Patreon-only videos. Plus, if you join the Piley Benton's Biggest Boys tier, you get your name read off at the end of every video, which I am about to do once I pull up the names. Zoth, Revo Pregame, Emily, Kyle Foley, Jennifer Jones, Caffeine Unicorn, Goblin of the Year, Stockwell Homestead, Nilic Elites, and Cameron Fordo. So if you want to hear your lovely name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.